and it's really a great camera. It's excellent. Yeah.
Is it good quality?
I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to the front room sessions at the Marcus Garvey House. Glad to be here. One more of our informal conversations with thought leaders in our community. Today I'm pleased to have a friend, a leader in the community, Dr. Sylvia Bartley, and a person I met today for the first time, but I've known about for a long time, Dr. Reba Peoples. This May is Mental Health Month, and we're talking about that today. Our particular take on the conversation is the question of mental health for Black people in general, Black women in particular. And I simply want to begin by asking my guests, Dr. Bartley and Dr. Peoples, to give us sort of a mental health 101. How do we begin as Black people, as community folks, to put ourselves in the mode of thinking to have a conversation about what mental health means to us? Dr. Peoples?
Sure. So I think having conversations like this one are very important. So really bringing these issues front and center. I think oftentimes there's a bit of shame and even stigma surrounding having struggles with depression or anxiety or other mental health issues. So I think the first step really is around awareness and being open and courageous enough to have these types of conversations.
Dr. Bartley, what are your thoughts?
You know, I agree. I think it's really important we have to break the stigma, right? There's still, some people still have shame and negativity associated with addressing mental health. Some people see it as a sign of weakness. And particularly as Black people, you know, just thinking about our historical context, or put it in a historical context, during slavery and segregation, and even today, we are kind of marginalized, right? We're oppressed and we're suppressed people. And as a result of that, we feel that we have to be strong and not kind of conform to those stereotypes. And part of that is being strong and breaking down barriers and overcoming almost every challenge that's put in front of us, and really ignoring the emotional toll that has on us, not just emotionally, but on our physical being. And then there's this article that I read last year that talked about Black women between something like 10 at night and 4 in the mornings are the times when they are depressed.
Really?
Because the rest of the times they're going out there and they're saving the world and being all things to all people. And so that kind of attitude that we have really doesn't do anything for emotional health. And to sit down, one, to be still, and then two, to even admit that we're having challenges emotionally is a big step forward.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is the front room session at the Marcus Garvey House, headquarters for Insight News in North Minneapolis. And today I'm talking with Dr. Sylvia Bartley, PhD, who is the author of the book Turning the Tide, Neuroscience, Spirituality, and My Path Toward Emotional Health. And my other guest is Dr. Reba Peoples, MD, who is a board-certified psychiatrist, and she is the founder of Imara Health and Wellness, where she empowers her patients with tools needed to become stewards of their own health and architects of their own destiny. And so, you know, this thing about our mind and our spirit and our brains, Sylvia, if I can call you that, you know, I was so fascinated and so happy that you wrote the book that I made reference to, because you were able to, from my point of view, explain things that were complex, that I thought might have been inaccessible because of the scientific difficulty, and you were able to translate that into common language, common experiences that made me feel I could understand. And so how important is it that we find ways to describe the complexity of the world in ways that every human being feels he or she has access to it, and in having access is able to navigate his or her way to fulfillment, wholeness, health, well-being. What do you think?
You put it so nicely, Al. Thank you. I'm not sure. I never perceived it as me explaining it simple. I just have a simple brain. I say to folks, and I have a simple approach, right? But I can also connect things. So being that neuroscientist, really kind of, I have depression, so Mental Health Month, let's try and break the stigma and label things. I'm someone that's lived with depression all my life, but yet only at the age of 50 did I go to a psychiatrist for the first time and be diagnosed with depression. And then when I was diagnosed, I had the wherewithal to argue with the psychiatrist and tell her that she was wrong in her diagnosis because of what I know about depression. And even though I lived my life feeling very different and not feeling like I fit in and feeling sad and had many, many, many dark moments, but at the same time overcoming several challenges, I didn't want to accept that. And so because I didn't want to accept it or label it, or I just had excuses for it, there's no reason why I could start that healing practice. But everything happens for a reason, and I believe that that journey was purposeful, because during that journey, that's when I dug deep internally to really find internal comfort and internal solace in why I'm feeling so bad externally. And by tapping internally, I tapped into my spiritual self and started my conscious journey. And then being that scientist and asking and seeking questions like why, and then being that scientist and trying to connect all three together, it really brought me to a place of understanding finally. So to your question, why is it important? I think if we understand the reasons behind things, we can better accept it and then work towards the most important thing, which is receiving help and starting the process of healing. I never understood it. I never understood it at all. And so it was only because of my seeking and asking those questions do I finally begin to understand a little bit of it, knowing it's a lifelong journey and that there's much more work to do.
And so, Dr. Peoples, with that as a background, how do you deliver help, assistance to patients, to your people that you counsel and advise? And that's kind of on the individual basis, but then how does the profession, as you see the profession, deliver value to community, to society?
As far as the framework that I use in working with patients, I really view things in terms of three pillars. So you can almost think about them as sort of three legs of a stool. If any of those legs is sort of off balance, the entire thing topples. So the first pillar really is about lifestyle. So what is it that we're doing for ourselves to make sure that we're as healthy as possible? So that's where it becomes important to really make smart decisions about our health. And SMART is an acronym, so it has to do with those modifiable lifestyle factors. Sleep, definitely it's very important to make sure that we're getting adequate sleep at night. That's when the brain rests and repairs itself. There are actually studies regarding sleep deprivation, increasing your risk of things like dementias. African Americans do have higher risks of Alzheimer's than the majority population. Movement, so physically exercising is extremely important. The A is about having an awareness practice, so really having some time to rest and be still and really connect to something larger than yourself. The R is about recognition of identity, so really knowing who we are as individuals, understanding what our values are. And T is about tailoring inputs into your body. So what is it that you're feeding yourself? So food plays a major role in emotional wellness as well as physical wellness. So we want to make sure that we're eating foods that are supporting brain health. But we also want to be aware of what we're feeding our spirits, what we're feeding our minds. So thinking about what is our media intake. So what does that news feed look like on Facebook? What kinds of music are we listening to? What kinds of programs are we listening to? What kinds of people are we surrounding ourselves with? So, relationships can be toxic, and there are sometimes that we do have to love people from a distance if they aren't people who are able to bring a loving and supportive presence into our lives. The second pillar is about biology. So is there something physically going on that might lead to problems with depression? So that's when we look at things like thyroid health, or looking at nutritional imbalances, or looking at stress and the impact on the adrenal glands. So there are many things that we can look at physically that impact wellness. And then the last pillar is really around spirituality. So there's deeper issues around identity, meaning, and purpose. So essentially, are we living lives that are in alignment with our values? So we can do all the right things, we can exercise and do yoga and drink green tea smoothies, but you can't really meditate your way out of a toxic environment, and you have to really understand who you are as you navigate through the world.
If I can add, what I really love about that approach is it's the mindful, holistic approach, and it's talking about prevention, as opposed to just dealing with symptoms. So we talk about depression, that is a symptom of something deeper. And so, you know, psychiatrists and traditional medicine just treat the symptoms and not treat the cause. And so you have many people that are on medication to deal with a symptom, but they would always be on that medication because they're not dealing with the cause, right? And so that's why I think this kind of functional medicine approach is really important, because it really is getting deep into prevention as well as looking at the cause.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is the front room session at the Marcus Garvey House. My guests are Dr. Sylvia Bartley, PhD. She is an author. She's actually as well the co-chair of the African American Leadership Forum. Is that correct? AALF, we call it ALF. It's an important organization that is mobilizing people in our community to take responsibility and to be accountable to each other and to our times for moving forward the community, the culture. And my guest is Dr. Reba Peoples, MD, founder of Imara Health and Wellness, where, as I said, it's a clinic that tries to give patients the tools they need to direct their own health and healing, to become architects of their own destiny. This is an important conversation. We want to continue developing conversations like this at the Marcus Garvey House. And if you like this conversation, if you think it's important, please like it, please share it, please become a regular. Let people know that we're having the conversation right now. Invite them to join the conversation. You can also comment on the conversation. So we're monitoring the feed on our I call it PDAs. That's how old I am. It's an iPad, right? It's an iPad. So if you want to join the conversation, we invite you to join it. Harry Colbert and I here from Insight News to facilitate your engagement as well. And Harry, jump in the conversation when you want to as well. Harry is engineering the session. And so, again, May is Mental Health Month, and we want to focus on the question of mental health in our community, black people and black women in particular. Sylvia, you said that these hours of the day, from what, 4 p.m. in the evening, or at nighttime, black women experience more depression. And the suggestion is they would probably experiencing it all day, but they can't afford to pay attention to it during the day because they're so saddled with the responsibility of shouldering life for themselves and everybody else, mostly everybody else during the day.
Absolutely.
Tremendous pressure. And so what does that mean for black women? Put that burden in perspective. Talk about, and I think we tend not to acknowledge the horrendous burden that we have allowed women to, that's the wrong words, that women struggle with. It's not we are allowing, women struggle with. And I think we need to talk about that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, depression and stress, it impacts everybody, right? But we're going to particularly home in on black women because it's a really, we are really important, and we normally get forgotten in this whole conversation. And as black women, we do take on many things in this lifetime, and we've talked about that earlier. But the important thing is, not only do we take it on, but we don't typically try and get help for it. We don't typically try and alleviate the stress that black women face. And we've got prime examples throughout our history. Let's talk about Maya Angelou and her life story and the things that she endured, and then the fact that she just became this great writer and poet and shared the world of her gifts. We think about Harriet Tubman and all the other great, lots of women every day in our community that are doing great things. But I always ask myself, what are they doing to address their stress? Now, there is all this data out there about black women's health and how we're on the top of the list of everything bad and the bottom of everything good. There's all these disparities in the healthcare system. And then when you think about the historical and racial context and the distrust and the misdiagnosis of African Americans in the healthcare system, I'm not surprised that African Americans do not go and seek help, right? But when we look at the stress and being a scientist, let's look at the physiology. So as many people know, in our bodies we have cells, right? And most of our cells have a structure called nucleus. And in the nucleus, it's packed with chromosomes, and chromosomes are packed with DNA. Now, DNA carries genetic information from one generation to the next. So there's this body of evidence out there that talks about weathering, and these chromosomes and the protective caps called telomeres. And telomeres are kind of like a biological clock, a molecular clock. It really determines the age of a cell. Cells naturally die, and the length of a telomere determines the age of a cell. So the shorter the telomere, the closer the cell is to its death. And when it reaches a certain length, the cell has basically died. And these studies have looked at the social economic conditions. In this one particular study in Detroit, and they looked in a very diverse community. They looked at the white population and the black population and did some comparisons to telomeres. And those white populations that live in a low social economic status, their telomeres are shorter than those that live in a more affluent situation or environment. Then when you look at African Americans or blacks, the telomeres are shorter in black people compared to white people, irrespective of their social economic status, right? And then when you look at African American women, their telomeres are shorter compared to their white female counterparts and black males. And basically the term weathering means it's the acceleration of the cell's aging by approximately 7.5 years. So I say that again, black women's cells are prematurely aging by 7.5 years. So we are dying at a more rapid rate internally if we look at our cell structure. So while people say that black don't crack, right, that's a good thing, but internally we have this physiology that is accelerated in terms of our cell's death. And that's when we talked earlier about we've got to understand what's behind it. These are the hidden things that are going on when we do carry all of that burden and not do anything to alleviate that stress. And Dr. Peoples is more apt than me in describing it, but it really is kind of staggering. When I heard that, I was just blown away because it really is impacting us at levels that we cannot even imagine. And then when you compound that with all of the data around the disparities for black women in health, one example is black women and white women, they get breast cancer at the same rate, yet black women die from cancer at twice the rate. Right? Black women are 3 or 4 times more likely to die from childbirth-related causes or even childbirth in the United States today. Right? And so in the healthcare system, it's not really serving us.
Dr. Peoples, just build from there. Explain, why is it so?
Well, I mean, I think there's a long history of stress and trauma that we have experienced as a people, dating all the way, back to the days of slavery. But I think the positive thing is that there is resilience that's built into our culture. So when you look at things like polyvagal theory or look at how the body really can handle stress, some of the things that do help people deal with stress would be community, so being in community, music, rhythm, so kind of repetitive rhythmic activity helps the body deal with stress. Dance, so there was an article recently about how dancing is actually one of the most protective things that you can do for cognitive health. So, better than Sudoku puzzles. So there are these aspects of our culture that really have helped us weather this long history of trauma and stress. So that's definitely something to be celebrated. So when we think about the numbers relating to black women being sort of half as likely to seek treatment for mental health issues, we also have to look at, how are these studies defining treatment? So generally it's treatment from a licensed professional, so be that a psychiatrist or a psychotherapist. But community support can also be very effective. Being out in nature can be very effective. I remember my grandmother always kept a garden. She would always go fishing. And we know that mindfulness, so those times when we are able to be completely still, that actually rewires the brain. So we tend to sort of decrease the amount of activity in the back part of our brain, so that fearful portion of our brain called the amygdala, and we strengthen connections in this front part of our brain, which is called the prefrontal cortex. So that has to do with things like logic and planning and rational decision making. So there are aspects of culture that we can rely on to help move us through some of these issues. And also now that we have gotten to a place where there is more cultural competence built into our mental health system, seeking out those formal pathways for treatment can also be very effective.
We have things like the barber shop and the beauty shop that are resources for us, and they help us acculturate or to respond to and alleviate the pressures that and so, but it's not board certified. That's the issue, you know.
But it still works.
But it works, yeah.
When we think about historically, when our people were enslaved, what are the things that they did? And I always wonder, how did anybody survive that? And when you think about the things that they did, these are the practices that they did without, you know, it being labeled a mindful practice that really helped them to manage through the most, you know, difficult of circumstances we can ever imagine.
So I'm thinking in conversations like this about at least two tracks. One track is the track of the individual, how the individual must take action, seek help, and resolve the tensions inside to become functional and to become healed and happy. I think happiness or peace, contentment is an objective that's universal. But then I'm also thinking about structural barriers and systems that have as their mission to deny our humanity, our existence. And I don't know if it's just us, maybe it's anybody else, but I can only speak from where I stand and the things that I face as challenges in the institutional world. And so, and I cannot simply say, let them do it. I mean, the pressure and oppression calls me to fight.
Exactly.
It calls me to resist. And one is two parts. One is to understand my own weaknesses, problems, challenges, and need for healing, to do that, but at the same time, to attempt to shield myself and ultimately change, challenge, dissipate that force that causes me misery and pain that I don't deserve, that I didn't earn, and that serves somebody else by disserving me. Does that make sense?
Exactly. Joan Baez has a wonderful quote, "Action is the antidote for despair." So when we look at sort of natural disasters, looking at 9/11 on one hand and looking at Hurricane Katrina on the other, when we look at rates of post-traumatic stress disorder after both of those incidents, individuals in Katrina have had much higher rates of post-traumatic stress disorder 5 years outside of the trauma. And that's interesting because when you look at the first 6 months outside of the event, the rates of PTSD were similar in both groups. But long term, the Katrina survivors had worse outcomes. And when you look back at the photos of Katrina, or you look at the photos of 9/11, what you see in 9/11, people are running. So people are running for their lives. They're actively dissipating those stress hormones and seeking safety. Whereas when you look at the photos of Katrina, people are stuck. So they're trapped, waiting to be rescued. So when we don't have an outlet to release those stress hormones, it festers, and it really does lead to worsening outcomes. So we definitely do have to take control of really understanding and recognizing the structures that are responsible for a lot of the pain that we see in our communities, and recognizing that a lot of things that get labeled as pathologies are actually functional adaptations to very dysfunctional environments. So the individual cannot be well outside of the wellness of the society as a whole.
And so our illness is part of the plan.
Exactly.
And to maintain our illness is part of the plan. I've said this often. We get the misery, they get the money. And so managing our misery becomes a revenue stream for somebody else. And the question is there a need for us to understand and to come to some realization that, this is again a classic Al McFarlane, to say that our health is our business.
Oh,
We have to
exactly.
be in the business of our own health, and we have to make it our business in the sense that the grandmothers would say it's your business, but in the literal sense. Healing is a big business, and it ought to be our business. Our
Exactly.
business ought to be our business. What do you think about that?
Right. I mean, there's profit in pathology. So really understanding what some of the motives are, even though, we hear that word resiliency bandied around quite a bit. But when you think about the root word of the word resiliency, the Latin root is resilire, and that means to return to an original state of being. So if the original state of being is one of inequality or oppression or marginalization, when we're telling people to be resilient, we're actually telling them to just get better at dealing with all the stuff that life is throwing at you. We're not really teaching people how to transform their situations and how to really transcend.
And in my simple brain, it's all part of the social engineering. So when you think about health access, why is it that people that can afford it have access to health? I mean, that premise for me just tells me anyway that people that cannot afford it, their health is going to deteriorate, and by their health deteriorating, they're going to stay in the place where people want them to be. So if you think about the African American community and the lack of access to healthcare that we have all around the world, whether we are dominant in the country like South Africa or considered a minority in, like living in diaspora, people don't have access to that healthcare. And when they do, it's not high quality healthcare most of the time. And then there's this misdiagnosis and this mistreatment. So it has to be our business to be healthy, because even if we fix other things like education and health, education and the structural things, if we're not healthy, we're unable to exist and enjoy those things. And so it should be priority number one to focus on our health. And it's difficult when you don't have health insurance. 20% of African Americans in the United States do not have health insurance. That is really difficult. So the mindful approaches, the approaches where you don't need the healthcare system, is equally important to bridge the gap and to complement what treatment that you need in a traditional healthcare system.
You've used the term mindful several times in this conversation. I want you to explore that, because I know you've written about, you've experienced, you've taught, or you've learned mindfulness as part of your journey. What does that mean for you, Sylvia?
For me it means ways in which you can heal thyself. So if we're talking about emotional health, what things can you do outside of the healthcare system that you can address your health? And Dr. Peoples mentioned it earlier, meditation, being still, really being quiet, just listening to the silence in between your thoughts, tapping into that internal self really has a calming effect on you. It decreases your cortisol levels, it increases your endorphins. There's an emerging body of science out there that is showing the physiological and neurochemical changes that's associated with being still and or meditation, which you can do for either a few minutes or 30 minutes, right? But just really tapping into your internal self can bring you to that place of calm. Simple things like breathing, right? Breathing in and breathing out. The trick is to breathe in shorter than you breathe out. And that is because you're stimulating, when you breathe out, your parasympathetic system. That brings everything down. The breathing in is stimulating your sympathetic system, correct, Dr. Peoples? And that means that's getting you ready to fight or flight. That's getting you ready to deal with a stressful situation. When people hyperventilate, they breathe in deeply because they have to deal with something stressful. And when you breathe out longer, you're doing the opposite and calming things down. So even if you're going into a stressful meeting or a stressful situation, taking a minute or less to breathe deeply, in for 4 and out for 7, 3 or 4 times, will bring you into a place where you can handle that better. The other part of that is exercise. Naturally, exercise decreases your cortisol levels, increases your natural endorphins, the feel-good hormones. Doing that on a regular basis, getting the blood pumped around your heart, it does so many good things for you that it prepares you better for any stressful situation that you're in. And then also eating. The foods that you eat is really important. If you eat inflammatory foods, what inflames your gut inflames your brain. So eating foods that don't give you that added cloudiness, the irritation, and making you foggy and adding to your depression, as opposed to making you feel better. And so really controlling your diet also has a fundamental impact on your sense of well-being. And then lastly, therapy. Whether it's therapy with your friends, the community that we talk about. Africans are very used to being a community-led organization, not organization, people. And so just being in fellowship or sisterhood with people that you trust, having a safe place that you can express yourself, then can you start the process of healing. So there are just a few of the mindful things that you can really do without having access to that healthcare system. Now, I'm not saying you don't need a healthcare system, because if you've got a chronic illness, of course you need to go to a physician and get that sorted out, but you'll be better placed to handle things that will come in your direction.
And that's giving you the agency, the power to start, to self-start.
Exactly.
And you can better utilize other resources if you have control from that side, I think. So, Sylvia, I was thinking as you were speaking, I'm going to ask you if you noticed this. When we were at the Humphrey Institute graduation last week, right, I was going to send you a photograph from my phone that I took of you and Laisha Ward and others, right? And all of a sudden, I couldn't think of your name. I'm 72. I have a family history of Alzheimer's and dementia. And so I'm, as we speak, conscious and thinking about, is my memory going to go? And am I likely prone to? And so when I'm sitting there, and I've addressed you already today, that day as Sylvia, but that moment when I was asking you to give me your email address, I couldn't think of Sylvia. How do the Al McFarlanes address that issue, the fear, number one, and the practicality of knowing that as you age, and because there are genetics involved, but there must be other things as well that I should be aware of. How do I look at mental health for me, personally, the individual? And not that I'm looking for a diagnosis now, but this is an opportunity to talk to people about how people should be aware and be planful. What do you think?
And there's really sort of a growing body of research.
Did you notice that, first of all, that I couldn't think of your name? Yes, you did. Okay, all right. Yeah.
Hey, you know, I'm 52 and it happens to me all the time.
Okay, well, you're gracious. Thank you.
And there are certain age-related changes that we can expect as we age, but we always want to be mindful of whether or not those changes are really impacting our ability to function as effectively as we can in the world. So there is kind of newer research that's emerging regarding brain health and even possibly reversing early signs of cognitive decline. So there's a researcher named Dale Bredesen who's sort of developed an entire set of protocols around brain health. So he looks at certain markers in the brain that are associated with a higher risk of developing Alzheimer's, and he has developed a protocol, so a set of protocols relating to how you should eat. So generally a lower carbohydrate, almost ketogenic diet can be useful. Looking at things like intermittent fasting, that can also be useful in reversing things like insulin resistance and helping increase blood sugar regulation. The interesting thing about Alzheimer's is that there's an impact on blood sugar metabolism in the neurons in people who do have Alzheimer's. So people are actually starting to refer to it as diabetes type 3. So really being aware of your diet is very important. Physical movement, so kind of getting exercise is very important. And then that community support. So isolation is probably one of the worst things that you can do for your brain. So really utilizing those things that you can do for yourself, but also taking advantage of the healthcare system, particularly if you have the sort of means and resources to access some of these newer therapies that could also be very useful in helping prevent or even reverse cognitive decline.
So also sleeping, right? But don't forget
Sleep, yes, extremely
rest,
important.
yeah.
Because of the explaining that one.
So when we sort of accumulate plaques and proteins in our brains during the day. And when we're in those deeper phases of sleep, so the sort of more restorative phases of sleep, that's when we do our housekeeping. So we sort of sweep out those proteins when we're in those deep phases of sleep. So people who are sleep deprived tend to have a higher risk of cognitive decline, and also a higher risk of other physical health symptoms. So a higher risk of obesity, higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of heart disease. And we know that when we do have things like heart disease, for example, that increases our risk for strokes and other issues that can really impact our brain health.
Check, 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 check. I'm listening. And so the question is, how do we get so that ordinary people have this conversation so that we're not afraid of the words, not afraid of looking at the mirror, looking at the brain, looking at our stability, our instability? How do we change the experience in community so that this is part of everybody's dinner conversation or casual conversation, though it's not a casual topic, but it should be something we're not fearful of discussing. Does that make sense to you?
It does. And I think people like you are important because you do have the platform to be able to reach people so that people can start to have a different awareness. And once people do have that level of awareness, they sort of become advocates and they're sort of more likely to go out and start these conversations, and then things spread from there.
And I think it's storytelling. It's a simple phrase, but storytelling, but not just telling the good stuff, but tell the stuff that may be considered bad or ugly. So just me, for example, being brave enough eventually to say, look, I am this kind of a person, I work in corporate America, I do all these wonderful things, and yet I have depression. That took a long time to say that. And once you say that, and I say it in the workplace, and I say it on whatever platform I'm on, it inspires and gives others permission to say the same, and then that's how you spark those conversations. It's really important to tell the full story and not just the good stuff that you think everyone's going to gravitate towards.
I'm Al McFarlane. My guest for this front room session at the Marcus Garvey House are Dr. Sylvia Bartlett, PhD. She is the co-chair of ALF, the African American Leadership Forum. She's the author of Turning the Tide, Neuroscience, Spirituality, and My Path Toward Emotional Health. She is a neuroscientist, neurophysiologist. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, great.
Years ago.
Okay. And the book describes her journey, her education, and her path towards becoming a PhD in neurophysiology. The book is fascinating. It's a wonderful read. And my guest is Dr. Reba Peoples, MD, founder of Imara Health and Wellness. Again, this is May. May is Mental Health Month, and we wanted to focus on Black women's mental health. And I want to sort of finish this on that. And I try to talk about visions for the future. And I would like to ask you both, Dr. Bartley and Dr. Peoples, to imagine or describe what you imagine would be the society that ought to be, that can be created, given where we are now, but given the knowledge that you have, under what conditions could we see demonstrable movement towards or attainment of peace, serenity, fulfillment, of completion, as human beings, and what role do Black women have to play? I think Black women would be the source of that, but what are your thoughts?
I will start. The word comes to mind, empowerment. So when I think about empowering Black women to take control of their health, to take control of their emotional health, their physical health, know their rights, and really understand how they can navigate themselves, not just through the healthcare system, but any system, and be the advocate for everybody else. And again, that's a burden, right? Because there's so many barriers that are centuries deep that we're not going to overcome in a heartbeat. But the good news is there is an increased level of awareness, and that's the first step. And there are organizations like, for example, the Black Women's Health Imperative, which is the only organization in the United States that's focusing on the health of Black women. And they're lifting up the good stories, the good stuff about Black women that are healthy and vibrant, and really elevating their stories to say this is what it can look like and this is what you can do, together with driving programs that address some of the health issues that are predominant in Black women, together with being the voice on the Hill in Washington to really advocate for black women's health. And when these new bills come out, to really break it down into what it means for black women. So this is all about empowerment. This is all about knowledge that can really empower people to go out there and drive change. So in the future, I do see a world where we have to, right? It's not even a pie in the sky vision. I do imagine a world where African Americans have a place of equity in this world, where these things that we're talking about, such as health and education and housing and employment, is afforded to us on an equal playing field, and that we're armed and we're ready and we're emotionally sound to be handling that kind of shift in where we are today to thrive and just be healthy communities that love on each other. I also imagine a world for our community where there is peace and love. I really think that once we understand our history and the reasons why we're in the situations we're in, there's no need to stay there. It is time to turn the tide, and it is time to really make a better future for ourselves by just being looking at each other with compassion and humanity, right? We're looking at everybody with compassion and humanity, and really just treating everybody like a human being. And so as a human being, we have rights to education, health, and all of those things, those social determinants of health. That means that we're going to be good and healthy.
And Dr. Peoples, what's your prescription? What do you see? What do you order for the world?
She's going to be more scientific than me.
Actually, no, I mean, my vision is very similar. So I would love to see us move toward Dr. King's vision of the beloved community. So where we all recognize our humanity and we, live and treat each other with mutual respect and compassion. I think it's important that we do recognize that, none of us is free until all of us are free. So, those systems and structures that have been built to advantage one group while disadvantaging others have to be dismantled. So that would be my vision.
And you think they can be dismantled?
I think they can.
Yeah, and I say that the world that we seek is both inevitable and imminent. And we have to operate with that kind of passion, moment by moment, step by step, believing that each step, each moment, each now counts. The now is the moment that counts. And how do we do with intentionality and with power and confidence every breath that we have, that we share. So, well, listen, this has been a good conversation. I want to do more.
Absolutely.
Sylvia, I think this is a beginning, and I think that if we could begin to have regular conversations that broaden the conversation and invite more people in, and our mission, my mission, is simply to put this language, this vocabulary in front of our people in ways that we can adopt it, embrace it, and utilize it, and this is a vocabulary that allows us to spell freedom.
Right.
Okay?
Thank you very much. We appreciate
Thank you.
having the opportunity to share our story.
Well, thank you so much. Harry, thank you for engineering the program. I'm Al McFarlane. This is the front room session at the Marcus Garvey House, one of a series of programs. I think on maybe June 4th, we're doing a special musical event with Douglas Ewart and a collection of creative artists who are going to sit and kick it, improvise, sing, talk about music, culture, talk about identity, talk about the same thing we've talked about. How do we use our minds and our spirits and our bodies to move ourselves, our people, and humanity, to move the planet, to move existence towards perfection. So if you like this conversation, if you agree with me that this is a necessary, important, and enjoyable, robust conversation, I invite you to be a part of it, like it on Facebook, and share it to your social media platforms. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Al McFarlane. We'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
The music, we listened with the opening and closing. The music is the tune Free Exchange by the artist Liz Gree. I think it's Liz Gree. Okay, great. Thank you. Cool. What do you think? You guys are brilliant. I mean, just